Welcome to The Sleepy Christian, where we explore the gentle stories of faith that help us reflect, rest, and reconnect with God. Tonight, we're going back to one of the most beautiful and quiet acts of courage in the Bible. The story of Ruth, a woman who could have chosen fear, but instead chose faith. As you listen, may your heart find peace. And before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. It's always so special to see how God's word reaches hearts across the globe. Now, let's begin. In the days when the judges ruled over Israel, the land was restless. There was no king, and people often did what was right in their own eyes. It was a time of uncertainty, of spiritual wandering, and of hardship. Among the many troubles the people faced, one of the most devastating was famine. The ground that once yielded grain and olives and grapes became dry and cracked. The rains seemed to forget the land, and hope began to fade with every passing season. In the small town of Bethlehem, ironically named House of Bread, the famine hit hard. Families struggled to survive. Fathers looked into empty storage jars and wondered how they would feed their children. Mothers rationed flour, praying for a miracle. Hunger doesn't just weaken the body, it wearies the soul. And in this time of crisis, one family made a difficult decision. A man named Elimelech, whose name meant "My God is King," decided to leave the land of Judah. He took with him his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. It must have been a heartbreaking choice, leaving behind their homeland, their relatives, the graves of their ancestors, and the land God had given to their people. But desperate times often lead us into unfamiliar places. They traveled east, crossing the Jordan River, into the land of Moab, a place that had once been hostile to Israel, a place with different gods and different customs. For some, this move would have seemed almost unthinkable, yet Elimelech was not seeking wealth or ease, only survival. Naomi must have carried a strange mix of hope and sorrow in her heart. She was leaving the familiar, following her husband, holding the hands of her young sons. She didn't know what would happen in Moab, but she trusted Elimelech's judgment. Perhaps the fields there still grew grain. Perhaps life would be more bearable, if not easier. At first, it seemed their gamble paid off. The family settled in Moab. The boys grew up and eventually married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. Life was different, but not without its blessings. Naomi, now a mother-in-law, might have begun to feel rooted again. But then, slowly and quietly, tragedy crept in. Elimelech died. We are not told how or why, but with his death, Naomi became a widow in a foreign land. Still, she had her two sons. She was not alone. Then the unthinkable happened. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died. No details, no explanation, just grief. Pain stacked upon pain, like storm clouds refusing to clear. Naomi, once full of life and love, was now left without husband, without sons, without grandchildren. Only her daughters-in-law remained. In the eyes of the world, her life had become barren, just like the land she had fled. She may have felt cursed, forgotten, or even punished. Alone in a foreign country, far from the place where she was born, Naomi faced the cold silence of loss. The famine had driven her from her home. The grave had taken those she loved most. And now, as she stood among foreign tombs, with only memories and two young women beside her, she faced a painful question that many of us face at some point in life. What do you do when everything falls apart? It is in this quiet sorrow, this empty space where grief echoes loudly, that the story of Ruth begins. And though we may not see it yet, even in the famine, even in loss, God was already at work. Quietly, faithfully, weaving together a story of redemption that would change not just Naomi's life, but the course of history itself. Naomi sat in silence, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but hollow, the kind that makes every breath feel heavy and every heartbeat echo with memories of what was lost. In Moab, she had once imagined a new beginning. When her sons married, she may have dreamed of grandchildren, of family dinners, of laughter once more filling her home. But now that home was empty, her husband, Elimelech, had been her anchor, her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, her joy, and all of them gone, without warning, without reason, without farewell. Grief has a strange way of distorting time. Days can feel like minutes or like eternities. Naomi moved through them like a shadow, going through motions with little meaning. The Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, her daughters-in-law, stayed by her side. They were kind, loyal. They wept with her. They tried to comfort her. But there are wounds that human words cannot touch. Only God could reach that deep. Then one day, Naomi heard a rumor. Just a whisper at first, a murmur of hope riding the desert winds. The Lord had visited his people. The famine in Bethlehem was over. The earth had begun to yield grain again. The house of bread was once again living up to its name. Crops were growing. Families were rejoicing. God had not forgotten Judah. For Naomi, the news struck her heart like lightning. Something awakened inside her, not quite joy, not quite excitement, but movement. The stirring of a desire to return, to go back home, to start over, not because she had a plan, but because she had nothing left to lose. And so, she gathered her things. There likely wasn't much. She had already lost most of what mattered. She prepared to leave Moab behind. But as she stood ready, Ruth and Orpah stepped forward too. They intended to go with her. It touched Naomi deeply. These young women had no obligation to her. They were Moabites. They had families of their own. They could have easily turned away, started new lives, remarried, built new futures. But they didn't. They chose to walk the road with her. Still, Naomi was realistic and bitter, though she tried to hide it. She loved Ruth and Orpah enough to want more for them than what she could give. She turned to them gently and said, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May you find rest in the home of another husband." She kissed them goodbye, and they all wept aloud. It was not just sadness, it was a sacred grief. A bond formed through shared sorrow, now being torn apart. Orpah and Ruth clung to her, protesting. "No," they said, "we will go with you to your people." But Naomi insisted. "Return, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons? Even if I did, would you wait for them to grow up? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." There it was, the honesty, the raw confession. Naomi wasn't just grieving her family. She was grieving God's silence. She felt abandoned, cursed, alone, and she didn't want Ruth and Orpah to carry that burden with her. She believed her story had ended, and she wanted them to write new ones. The three women cried again, and this time, Orpah slowly let go. She kissed Naomi and turned back toward Moab. We often judge her decision too harshly, but Orpah did what many would have done. She chose the familiar, the safe, the logical path. She loved Naomi, but not enough to risk everything for an uncertain future. But Ruth did not move. She did not turn back. She held on, quietly, fiercely. And Naomi looked at her, perhaps confused, perhaps frustrated, perhaps afraid to hope. There are moments in grief when even love feels too heavy, but Ruth's silence spoke volumes. She wasn't leaving. What was Naomi thinking in that moment? Did she see a glimpse of divine love in Ruth's stubborn presence? Or was she too numb to understand what was unfolding? Perhaps both. What she could not yet see was that her journey was no longer her own. It would become a story shared, a story of unlikely grace, unfolding on dusty roads and beneath the gaze of a God who had never really turned away. The road stretched long and uncertain before them, winding back toward Judah. But before they could take a single step, they had to make a decision, one that would change the course of their lives. Naomi stood still, her eyes already distant, perhaps imagining the hills of Bethlehem in the far-off distance. But the present moment pressed in on her with its own weight. She turned once again to the two young women who had stood beside her through grief and silence, Orpah and Ruth. Their eyes were red from weeping, their hearts torn between love and loss. She looked at them, perhaps with trembling lips, and said what she felt must be said. "Return, my daughters. Why should you come with me?" It wasn't just a plea, it was protection. Naomi was not trying to push them away out of coldness, but out of a kind of wounded wisdom. She had walked with pain long enough to recognize its patterns, and she knew that her future held little promise. She was a widow returning to a land where she had no husband, no sons, no wealth. She could offer no security, no guarantee, no joy. In her mind, she was bringing them into a life of nothingness. But her words carried more than practicality. They carried sorrow. "Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" she asked with gentle anguish. "Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" The questions hung in the air like smoke after a fire, lingering in their sadness. She finished with a cry from the depths of her soul. "No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." In that moment, Naomi revealed the full weight of her despair. She believed, truly believed, that God had turned away from her, that she was no longer favored, no longer seen. Her words were not spoken in rebellion, but in heartbreak. She wasn't angry with God. She was just lost, and she didn't want to drag Ruth and Orpah down into that same abyss. The three women broke down again. They wept openly, the way people do when grief has worn down every mask, every defense, the kind of tears that come from love that knows it must let go. And then Orpah stepped forward. With trembling hands, she reached for Naomi. She embraced her. She kissed her cheek. She wept on her shoulder. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to say goodbye, but in the end, she did. Orpah turned back. And who could blame her? She was still young. She could remarry. She could stay in her own land, among her own people. She could rebuild her life with the pieces she had left. That was the safe choice, the rational one. And it was not wrong, but it was the end of her story in Scripture. A single name, a single goodbye, and then silence. Sometimes the most difficult part of faith is not choosing between right and wrong, but between good and better. Orpah did what many would do, what most did. She loved, she wept, she cared, and then she turned back to what she knew. But Ruth remained. Naomi must have sensed her presence still by her side. She turned and said to her, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." She was giving Ruth an escape, another opportunity to walk away without shame. Naomi thought she was releasing her from obligation, but Ruth did not move. And then, in a voice both gentle and unshakable, Ruth spoke words that would echo through the ages. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." These were not simply words of love. They were words of covenant, of deep, abiding loyalty. Ruth wasn't just following Naomi. She was giving up her past. She was turning her back on her homeland, her culture, her family, even her religion. She was leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe. Why? Because something in Naomi had shown Ruth the God of Israel. In Naomi's grief, in her quiet strength, in her broken but honest heart, Ruth had seen a truth deeper than her Moabite roots. And she responded not with logic, but with faith. Faith doesn't always make sense. It doesn't follow the path of least resistance. It chooses love over safety, devotion over comfort, courage over control. Ruth chose all of that in one breathless vow. And Naomi, perhaps stunned into silence, said no more. The scriptures simply say that when Naomi realized Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. The two women turned and began walking. No more speeches, no more arguments, just the sound of footsteps on dirt, two broken hearts moving forward, one grieving widow and one brave young woman who chose faith over fear. The road from Moab to Bethlehem was not an easy one. It wound through valleys and hills, across sun-beaten plains and dusty ridges. It was the kind of road that gave you time to think, perhaps too much time. Naomi walked in silence, her mind turning with memories she could not shake. Her husband's laugh, her sons as boys, chasing one another through fields of grain, the weddings, the funerals. It all blurred together like a dream that turned slowly into a nightmare. Beside her walked Ruth, steady, quiet, determined. She didn't complain, she didn't ask how much farther. She walked like someone who had already counted the cost and decided the journey was worth it. Step by step, she stayed near Naomi, offering not words, but presence, the most powerful comfort of all. And though Naomi said nothing, she must have felt it. That strange, unexplainable peace that comes from knowing someone is walking with you through your sorrow, not trying to fix it, not offering advice, just walking. For Ruth, the decision had already been made. Her heart was set. She had spoken her vow beneath the open sky, and those words weren't empty poetry. They were a spiritual anchor. Where you go, I will go. That promise was now becoming a reality. With every mile, Ruth was leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her home in Moab, left behind. The gods of her childhood, left behind. Her family, left behind. In their place, Ruth had embraced a new identity. She was no longer a Moabite in her heart. She had grafted herself into Naomi's people, into Naomi's God, into a covenant bigger than either of them could yet see. It was not a logical decision. It was a spiritual one, a faith decision. Perhaps she didn't know all the customs of the Israelites. Perhaps she didn't understand every law or tradition. But what she knew was enough. Naomi's God was not like the gods of Moab. He was not a God of cruelty or transaction. He was a God who heard the cries of the broken, who remembered his people even when they forgot him, a God of covenant, a God of mercy, and Ruth had placed her life in his hands. When they finally reached the outskirts of Bethlehem, the town was abuzz. After all, Naomi had been gone for over a decade. People whispered. Faces peered out from windows. Women gathered at doorways asking the same question. Can this be Naomi? She looked different, older, tired, worn by grief in a way that no one could miss. The brightness in her eyes had dimmed. Her back, once upright with pride, now curved with the weight of sorrow. She heard their voices, and instead of joy, she answered with bitterness. Don't call me Naomi, she said, her voice steady but heavy. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. It was a heartbreaking confession. Naomi, whose name meant pleasant, no longer saw herself that way. She had tasted suffering, and it had changed her identity. She believed that God had dealt harshly with her, that he had taken more than he had given, that her story was one of loss, not redemption. But she was wrong. Not because her grief wasn't real, but because her story wasn't over. What Naomi couldn't see in that moment of honesty was the woman standing quietly beside her, Ruth, a living promise, a silent testimony to God's faithfulness, even in the shadows. Ruth didn't interrupt. She didn't correct Naomi. She simply stood there, present, devoted. The world saw a grieving widow and a foreign girl, but heaven saw the beginning of something miraculous. And though Naomi felt empty, she was more full than she realized. The timing of their arrival was no accident. They reached Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, a season of gathering, a season of new growth, a time when the fields whispered promises to the wind, promises that something good was coming. Naomi couldn't see it yet. She still felt like Mara, bitter, broken, used up. But God was already at work. Sometimes, the beginnings of redemption don't look like miracles. They look like weary footsteps on a dusty road. They look like tears and silence. They look like someone staying when they have every reason to go. They look like Ruth. And though Naomi had no idea what was about to unfold, heaven was smiling. Because Ruth's vow, "Where you go, I will go," was not just loyalty. It was the first ripple in a wave of divine grace that would stretch all the way to the birth of a savior. Faith had taken its first step, and God, quietly, was guiding the way. The sun rose gently over the hills of Bethlehem, casting golden light on the land that had once suffered famine, but was now stirring with signs of life. Barley swayed softly in the breeze, the harvest just beginning. The town, though still small, buzzed with movement. Farmers sharpening tools, women preparing baskets, workers gathering in the fields with renewed hope after years of struggle. For Naomi and Ruth, the morning brought no fanfare. There was no parade to welcome them, no feast to celebrate their return. They arrived not as honored guests, but as two widows. One once familiar, now nearly forgotten, the other a foreigner whose name carried little meaning in this new land. Naomi returned to the town of her youth not with laughter, but with lines etched by grief. Her eyes carried the weight of years spent in sorrow, and Ruth, though younger, bore a quiet strength that made her seem older than her years. She was stepping into a world she didn't know, among people who didn't know her. She spoke with an accent, she looked like an outsider, and perhaps to many she was. But Ruth was not focused on appearances or acceptance. Her concern was Naomi. Her heart was set on caring for the woman who had lost so much. Her home, her husband, her sons, her joy. Ruth's decision to walk beside Naomi had not been a moment of impulse. It had been a sacred vow, and now she was living it out, one quiet choice at a time. They had little, perhaps nothing beyond what they could carry. They needed food. They needed a place in this new life. Ruth could have sat in despair. She could have said, "I've done enough," or "This is not my problem." But instead she looked to the fields and saw an opportunity, not for wealth, but for service. She turned to Naomi and said with humility and courage, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." It was a bold request. In ancient Israel, gleaning was the right of the poor. According to God's law, landowners were to leave the edges of their fields untouched and allow the poor, the widows, the orphans and the foreigners to gather what remained. It was God's way of ensuring that even the vulnerable had dignity, an act of divine justice written into the daily life of his people. But even so, it was no easy task. Gleaners were often looked down upon. They were seen as charity cases, burdens. And Ruth, being both a widow and a Moabite, risked not just rejection, but ridicule, or worse, mistreatment by men who saw her as defenseless. Naomi, weary but trusting, agreed. "Go ahead, my daughter." And so Ruth stepped into the fields. Her feet found uneven ground, her hands reached for stalks already passed over, her eyes searched for kindness in a place where she had no standing. She did not demand favor, she hoped for it. She did not assume safety, she prayed for it. Somewhere in the vastness of the fields, Ruth began her quiet work. She stooped low, gathering bits of grain left behind by workers, grain that others considered too small, too broken, too unworthy to bother with. But she gathered it all. Every piece mattered. Every kernel was a step toward survival, toward faithfulness, toward something unknown but beautiful. She did not know where her feet had led her. She did not know whose field she had wandered into. But the writer of Ruth tells us with subtle, divine irony. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. As it turned out, what a gentle phrase to describe God's perfect orchestration. To Ruth, it was chance, a fortunate accident, but to God, it was the beginning of redemption, a divine appointment hidden in the ordinary, a moment where the invisible hand of providence guided her steps without announcement or explanation. Ruth didn't yet know the name Boaz. She didn't know that he was a relative of Elimelech. She didn't know that he was kind, honorable, respected, a man of standing. She didn't know that this field, chosen by what seemed like coincidence, would become the soil where her destiny would grow. All she knew was that she had work to do, to care for Naomi, to glean, to be faithful in the small things. And sometimes that is all faith is, doing the next right thing, even when the path is uncertain. Back in town, Naomi may have sat in silence, wondering how Ruth was faring, wondering what kind of God had led her back to a land she had left in sorrow. But God was already writing a story, one of loyalty, of redemption, of love, unfolding in the most unlikely places. There is something sacred about the quiet, ordinary faithfulness of Ruth's actions. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. She didn't even need understanding. All she needed was the belief that God was still good and that loving someone in their grief was holy work. And so, in the fields outside Bethlehem, while others reaped the harvest, a foreign widow named Ruth bent low to gather what the world left behind. But heaven was watching, and grace was growing. The sun climbed slowly in the sky, casting long shadows across the golden fields of barley. It was the season of harvest, a time of rejoicing and plenty for many in Bethlehem. Laughter echoed across the land as workers moved rhythmically through the fields, gathering what months of patience and labor had produced. But for Ruth, the harvest held no celebration, only hard, humble work. She rose early in the morning, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and walked quietly to the field. There were no servants to help her, no one to carry her load. She was a gleaner, a quiet figure at the edge of the workers, gathering the leftovers of the harvest, the bits of grain too small or scattered for the reapers to collect. It was not glamorous, and it was not easy. The work was exhausting, often done under the hot sun, with hands scratched and knees sore from bending again and again. Yet Ruth did not complain. Every grain she collected was an act of love. Every stalk she tucked into her bundle was for Naomi. She worked not to enrich herself, but to nourish the one she had vowed never to leave. Her hands were blistered by kindness. Her back was bent by devotion. Her soul was lifted by faith. Others may have whispered as she passed. After all, she was a foreigner, a Moabite. Her accent was strange, her customs unfamiliar. She was an outsider among God's people, and in ancient times, that was no small thing. Yet Ruth never lowered her gaze. She walked with quiet dignity, not demanding respect, but living in such a way that it was slowly, silently earned. The landowner's men took notice of her. She was not like the others. She asked for nothing more than the right to glean, and she had arrived early, working steadily from morning until now with hardly a moment's rest. She was not entitled. She was not lazy. She was a living portrait of patience and resilience. And then Boaz arrived. He was a man of stature and respect in Bethlehem, not just wealthy, but honorable, known for his integrity, for his fear of the Lord. As he entered the field, he greeted his workers with a blessing. "The Lord be with you." And they responded in kind. "The Lord bless you." Boaz was the kind of man who understood that leadership began with humility and kindness. He noticed things others missed, and that day, he noticed Ruth. "Whose young woman is that?" he asked the overseer. The reply was immediate. "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She asked to glean and has been working steadily from morning till now, with only a short rest in the shelter." Boaz watched her for a moment. There was something remarkable in the way she moved, not just the labor, but the spirit behind it. She was not there for herself, she was there for another, and that kind of devotion spoke louder than words. He approached her gently, not with command, but with kindness. "My daughter," he said, a term of respect, not condescension. "Listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." In those few words, Boaz offered Ruth something she had not yet known in this land: safety, dignity, belonging. Overwhelmed, Ruth bowed low to the ground. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes?" she asked. "That you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz smiled. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." These were not empty blessings. They were words of recognition, honoring Ruth's sacrifice, her loyalty, her courage. In a time when women like Ruth were easily overlooked, Boaz saw her. He saw not her nationality, not her poverty, but her heart, and he spoke life into her soul. Later that day, Boaz invited Ruth to join him and his workers for a meal. She sat among them, a Moabite among Israelites, breaking bread, dipping into vinegar, eating until she was satisfied, even having some left over. In this simple act, a barrier was broken. A new beginning was unfolding. When she returned to glean, Boaz gave secret instructions to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. Don't rebuke her. That day, Ruth gleaned more than she ever expected. She filled her arms with barley, enough for herself and Naomi, enough to say, "God sees us." She walked back home as the sun dipped below the horizon, carrying not just food, but hope. She had come to Bethlehem as a stranger, but she was beginning to feel the faint warmth of welcome. Not through grand gestures or sudden miracles, but through kindness, through hard work, through the quiet unfolding of grace. And though she did not yet know the full story, Ruth had already become a part of something sacred. She was gathering more than grain. She was gathering the first pieces of a divine promise, one stalk at a time. The sun was beginning to set when Ruth returned to the small house she now shared with Naomi. Her arms were full, heavier than on any day before. Barley spilled from her bundle and tucked into the folds of her garments was something else. Roasted grain, left over from the meal Boaz had invited her to share. A simple meal, perhaps, to those who lived with plenty. But to Ruth, it was a quiet miracle. When Naomi saw all that Ruth had gathered, her eyes widened in astonishment. This wasn't the typical gleaning of a poor widow scraping by at the edge of someone's field. This was abundance. It was more than enough for both of them, with enough to spare for the next day, and maybe even the one after that. Naomi's heart stirred with something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. "Where did you glean today?" she asked, wonder in her voice. "Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth, unaware of the deeper significance of her day, answered simply and earnestly, "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." At that moment, Naomi's heart must have skipped a beat. Boaz, a name from her past, a name woven into her family's history. She looked at Ruth, her eyes filled with the glimmer of something long buried beneath grief, recognition, providence. "The Lord bless him," Naomi exclaimed. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." For the first time in many years, Naomi spoke not with bitterness, but with blessing. Her words, once sharpened by sorrow, now flowed with gratitude. She turned to Ruth, her voice trembling with awe. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." In ancient Israel, the guardian redeemer, or Goel, held a sacred role. He was a close male relative who could protect the rights of the vulnerable, redeem land that had been sold, restore family lineage, even marry a widow to preserve the name of a deceased brother. It was not just a social duty, but a spiritual one. And Boaz was such a man. Ruth listened, absorbing words and customs that were still new to her. She didn't yet understand the full weight of what Naomi was saying, but she understood one thing. Boaz was kind, exceptionally kind. He had noticed her. He had protected her. He had given beyond what was required. That alone was enough to plant a seed of trust. She told Naomi everything, how Boaz had spoken gently to her, how he had told her to stay in his field, how he had invited her to eat with his workers, and how the other women had accepted her among them. She had not felt like an outsider that day. She had felt seen. Naomi nodded, her heart swelling. "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field, you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women working under Boaz's protection. Day after day, she gleaned in his fields, and day after day, Boaz noticed her, not with the gaze of infatuation, but with the deep respect of a man who recognized character, integrity, and strength. He watched how she moved through the rows of barley and wheat, how she treated the other workers with gentleness, how she carried herself with quiet dignity. He knew her story, how she had left her homeland, her people, her gods, to follow Naomi and to seek shelter under the wings of the God of Israel. He saw in her a faith that had taken root in foreign soil and grown strong through trial. Boaz was not a man who acted on impulse. He was thoughtful, deliberate, guided by honor. But each day, as he watched Ruth working among his fields, something stirred within him. She was different. She wasn't just beautiful in appearance. She was beautiful in soul. She radiated the kind of strength that comes not from comfort, but from sacrifice. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She wasn't asking for anything. And yet, she had quietly earned the respect of all who watched her. He began to leave more grain for her to find. He made sure his men continued to protect her. He offered her water from the jars filled by others. Every gesture, though small, was a whisper of care, a signal of something deeper beginning to form beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Naomi watched the unfolding story from the edges. Each evening, Ruth returned with grain, with news, with stories of Boaz's continued kindness. Naomi's eyes, once dim with grief, began to shine again. She saw what Ruth could not yet see, the possibility of redemption, not just for Ruth, but for both of them. For so long, Naomi had believed her life was over, that God had turned away. But now, through the quiet actions of a man named Boaz and the steadfast love of a woman named Ruth, she began to believe again. She began to dream again. Harvest continued. Barley turned to wheat. Days passed, fields emptied, and all the while, Ruth kept gleaning, kept gathering, kept working, not for glory, not for gain, but because faithfulness was now part of her very being. She had left Moab with nothing but a vow and a heart full of courage. She had arrived in Bethlehem as a stranger, but through humility, loyalty, and the unseen hand of God, Ruth was slowly being woven into something far greater than she had imagined. Boaz, the guardian redeemer, had noticed her, but more importantly, God had noticed her too. In the hidden places of barley fields and under the shade of fig trees, love was taking root, and heaven, as always, was watching. The harvest season came to a quiet close. The fields, once golden and full, now stood bare, the earth resting after its labor. The air grew cooler, and Bethlehem settled into a slower rhythm. Workers returned home. The songs of reapers faded. But in the hearts of Naomi and Ruth, something new was beginning to stir. Ruth had continued to glean throughout both the barley and the wheat harvests, staying close to the other women in Boaz's field, just as Naomi had advised. Day after day, she returned home with grain and quiet stories of kindness. And every night, Naomi listened not just to the words, but to the silence between them, to the soft admiration in Ruth's voice, to the invisible thread that seemed to connect her to Boaz, though neither had yet spoken of it. Naomi had lived long enough to see how God worked slowly, subtly. She began to sense that Ruth's presence in Boaz's field was not an accident, nor was Boaz's generosity mere politeness. It was something more, something sacred, a possibility waiting to unfold. So Naomi began to plan, not out of manipulation, but out of maternal love. She wanted security for Ruth. She wanted to see this loyal, courageous young woman find rest, not just food on the table, but a future, a home, a life redeemed from the pain they had both known. One evening, Naomi spoke. Her voice was gentle but firm. "My daughter," she said, "should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for?" She explained her thoughts carefully. Boaz was a close relative, one of their guardian redeemers. According to tradition, he had the right to redeem the family line, to take Ruth as his wife and raise up descendants in honor of her late husband's name. But Boaz had made no move, perhaps out of respect, perhaps waiting for a sign. Naomi believed it was time. She gave Ruth detailed instructions. "Tonight," she said, "Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." It was the end of harvest ritual, where the grain was tossed into the air to separate it from the chaff. It was hard work, often done in the evening when the breezes were cool and steady. "Wash, put on perfume, and dress in your best clothes," Naomi said. "Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." To modern ears, the plan might sound strange or even improper, but in ancient Israelite culture, this was not a seduction. It was a sacred, symbolic act of humility and request. By uncovering his feet and lying down, Ruth would be asking Boaz to take her under his protection, to fulfill the role of guardian redeemer. It was bold, vulnerable, and entirely rooted in the customs of covenant law. Ruth listened carefully. And then she answered with the same spirit she had shown from the beginning. "I will do whatever you say." That night, under the cover of darkness, Ruth walked to the threshing floor. The smell of grain and dust hung in the air. She kept to the shadows, watching from a distance. She saw Boaz eat, drink, and settle down beside a heap of harvested grain. The work of the day was done. He stretched out, content, and fell asleep. With quiet steps, Ruth approached. Her heart must have been racing. She was doing something that required deep trust, not only in Naomi, not only in Boaz, but in God himself. She was placing herself at the mercy of a man who had the power to reject or redeem, a man she respected, a man whose kindness had already begun to feel like shelter. She found where he lay. She knelt. Gently, she pulled back the blanket covering his feet and lay down. And there, in the stillness of the night, she waited. At midnight, Boaz stirred. Something startled him. He reached for his blanket and realized someone was there. "Who are you?" he asked, startled, his voice breaking the quiet. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." It was more than a request for marriage. It was a plea for restoration. Spread your garment was a cultural phrase, a symbol of protection, of belonging. It echoed the very language God used when he spoke of covering his people with love and care. Ruth was not demanding. She was entrusting herself to Boaz's character, asking for redemption not just as a woman, but as a thread in a broken family line that longed to be restored. Boaz was silent for a moment, and then he answered, not with hesitation, but with honor. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." In the darkness, something holy passed between them. Mutual respect, sacred responsibility, and the first breath of something that felt like love. Boaz did not see a Moabite. He did not see a beggar in the field. He saw a woman of honor, a woman whose courage had become her beauty, a woman whose heart shone brighter than her story of loss. But Boaz was also a man of integrity, and there was one complication. "There is another who is more closely related than I," he said. "Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it." He asked Ruth to stay the rest of the night, not out of impropriety, but protection. The threshing floor could be dangerous for a woman alone, and Boaz, true to his nature, would not let her walk into that danger. Before dawn, before anyone could see her and question her presence, he sent her home, carrying 6 measures of barley, an extravagant gift for Naomi. When Ruth returned, Naomi was waiting. She opened the door, eyes wide with anticipation. "How did it go, my daughter?" she asked. Ruth told her everything, every word, every gesture, every promise. And Naomi smiled, not with surprise, but with peace. "Wait, my daughter," she said, "until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." In the hush of that morning, Ruth may not have known what the day would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. She had placed her heart and her future into the hands of a Redeemer, and she had done so with the kind of faith that always moves the hand of God. The threshing floor had not been a place of scandal. It had been a sacred altar, where vulnerability met virtue, where brokenness met compassion, where a foreign widow asked to be covered, and a righteous man said yes. The morning sun had barely risen when Boaz walked through the gates of Bethlehem with purpose in every step. The town, still waking, had no idea that a matter of deep importance was about to unfold within its ancient walls. Boaz was not a man who delayed when duty called, and this was more than duty. It was the quiet unfolding of redemption, and he was ready to act. At the town gate, where elders gathered to settle matters of law and justice, Boaz sat down. He waited with watchful eyes until the man who was more closely related to Naomi's family, the one with the legal right to redeem Elimelech's land and family name, passed by. Boaz called out to him, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." The man obliged, unaware that a decision lay before him that would echo for generations. Then Boaz gathered 10 elders of the town to serve as witnesses. This was not a casual conversation, it was a legal moment, a transaction not only of land but of legacy. Boaz began carefully. He told the man, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these elders. If you will redeem it, do so. But if not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." The man considered it. Land was a valuable asset, a chance to increase wealth, to expand legacy. "I will redeem it," he said. But Boaz was not finished. He continued, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At that moment, everything changed. This was not merely a financial decision, it was a covenantal one. To redeem the land was to redeem the legacy. To marry Ruth was to raise up a child in the name of her deceased husband, to ensure that Elimelech's line would not be forgotten. It meant sharing inheritance, reputation, and risk. The man hesitated. "Then I cannot redeem it," he said. "I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." And with those words, the way was made clear. To finalize the transaction, the man removed his sandal, a traditional symbol of legal agreement in ancient Israel, and handed it to Boaz. The witnesses nodded. The deal was done. Boaz stood, his voice clear and steady before the elders and all who had gathered. "You are witnesses today," he said, "that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today, you are witnesses." And they responded with a blessing, a powerful, prophetic chorus of affirmation. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Boaz returned home not just with a new title, but with a promise, a vow not made lightly, but with love, honor, and responsibility. And Ruth, once a foreigner, once a widow gleaning at the edge of the fields, became his wife. The wedding was not a grand ceremony by modern standards, but it was holy. It was more than two people coming together. It was the redemption of a family, the healing of a lineage, the fulfillment of a quiet, persistent hope. And God, in His mercy, blessed their union. In time, Ruth became pregnant. She gave birth to a son, a healthy, strong child, a miracle from the God under whose wings she had sought refuge. The women of the town gathered around Naomi, celebrating with joy that had long been absent from her heart. "Praise be to the Lord," they said, "who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May He become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Naomi, who had once called herself Mara, bitter, now cradled a child in her arms. Her arms that had once felt so empty now held the fullness of God's grace. Her lap, once a place of sorrow, became a throne of joy, and they named the child Obed. Obed would become the father of Jesse, and Jesse would become the father of David. Yes, that David, the shepherd, the warrior, the poet king, the man after God's own heart. And many generations after David, from the same family line, another baby would be born in Bethlehem. Not into wealth, but into wonder. Not into safety, but into purpose. A child who would carry the weight of redemption for the entire world. Jesus, the Christ, the Redeemer, the fulfillment of every whispered hope. All of it, every step, every sorrow, every silent choice had led to this. From famine to fullness, from ashes to legacy, from grief to glory. And it all began when Ruth said yes, when Boaz chose honor, when 2 broken lives trusted the quiet hand of God. In the end, it was not power, position, or pride that shaped history. It was love. Humble, patient, faithful love. And heaven had smiled all along. The child's cries filled the small home in Bethlehem, not with sorrow, but with life, with joy, with the kind of sound that turns silence into song. Naomi held the newborn close, tears glistening in her eyes, though they were not the same tears she had wept in Moab. These were different. These were tears that flowed from a soul being restored, tears that whispered, "God has not forgotten me." This child, Obed, was not born from Naomi's own body, but he was hers in the ways that truly mattered. He was the fruit of sorrow transformed into joy, of bitter journeys made sweet. He was a sign, tangible and warm in her arms, that the story she once thought ruined had, in truth, only just begun. The women of the town gathered around her. They had witnessed her return from Moab with grief etched on her face and a foreign daughter-in-law by her side. They had seen her walk the quiet streets of Bethlehem, empty and uncertain. But now they saw her full, filled not just with the presence of a child, but with the presence of hope. And they said, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a redeemer." They weren't just talking about Boaz, they were talking about the child, for in this small boy, a new line had begun. A line that carried with it the promises of generations, a line that would stretch far beyond the hills of Bethlehem. This child would one day become the grandfather of Israel's greatest king, David. Imagine that. The widow from Moab, the outsider, the gleaner, the woman without a people, was now the great-grandmother of royalty. How extraordinary, how divine, and how quiet. Because God's greatest acts rarely come with thunder or spectacle. They begin with ordinary people making extraordinary choices. They begin with small acts of loyalty, with whispered prayers, with the humble faith of a woman who said, "Where you go, I will go." Ruth's story began in loss, in hunger, in leaving everything behind. She had no promise of reward, no guarantee of kindness, and yet she walked forward, not because she saw the end, but because she trusted the next step. And Boaz, too, was not a man of dramatic miracles. He simply did what was right. He protected the vulnerable. He honored the law. He extended kindness where others might have withheld it. In a world where men often took what they wanted, Boaz gave, and what he gave became the foundation for something eternal. Their son, Obed, was born into this quiet, sacred love, a love built not on passion or pride, but on faithfulness, on covenant, on the steady choice to care, to commit, to trust. And from Obed would come Jesse, and from Jesse, David, the shepherd boy who would slay giants, write psalms, lead a nation, fall deeply, rise again, and become a man after God's own heart. But even David was not the end of the story, because generations later, from this same lineage, another child would be born in Bethlehem. He would not be laid in the arms of a grieving widow, but in a feeding trough. He would not be wrapped in sorrow, but in swaddling cloths. And he too would be called a redeemer, not just of a family, but of the world. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, descended from Ruth and Boaz, from Obed and Jesse, from David the King. It's almost hard to comprehend that the same God who governs the stars, who speaks galaxies into existence, would choose to bring salvation through the faithfulness of a Moabite widow and a kind-hearted man in a barley field. But that is the heart of God. He does not need the mighty, he does not seek the grand. He finds beauty in the broken, he plants hope in the humble, and he tells the greatest stories through those the world forgets. Ruth, the foreigner, Naomi, the grieving mother, Boaz, the quiet redeemer, Obed, the infant in Naomi's arms. Each a thread in the tapestry of redemption, each a reminder that no life is too small, no sorrow too deep, no journey too lost for God to redeem. If Ruth had chosen fear, the story would have ended at the border of Moab. If Boaz had chosen pride, Ruth might have remained a gleaner forever. But they chose something else. They chose faith, they chose love. And because they did, you and I have a Redeemer who came from that very line, Jesus, whose love still redeems, whose grace still restores, whose story still invites us to believe that our own lives too are part of something eternal. And so, as Ruth's story ends, it is not with a period, but with a promise. That faith, no matter how small, is never wasted. That love, when rooted in God, always multiplies. And that even the quietest lives, lived in faithfulness, can echo through eternity.